They weren't fraudulent elections. They weren't bent. There wasn't any cheating. They were genuine elections in which the majority sustained Chavez because Chavez represented a transformation of people's lives, a real transformation of people's lives. Education is perhaps the best representation of that. Then in 2006, for me, the direction changes. And it leads from there to the current moment. Because I think what then happens is that the Chavez, now again in the presidency, announces the formation of a new organization which is called the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, PSUV. And when it was presented to the people, it was an organization, it would be an organization of mass democracy. It would be an organization of people's power. The next step in devolving power from a central state back to the grassroots. That's how it was presented. And that's why nearly 6 million people joined it in a couple of weeks. Chavez, one of the things I always found very kind of amusing was the fact that he had this television program on Sunday mornings, afternoon, and sometimes evening as well, called Allo Presidente, which infuriated some people. But what I always found funny was that he would sit here, at his table with his coffee and talk to people. And the front row, you lot, would all be ministers of the government. And they always looked very grim. They always looked very worried. They never smiled, they never laughed at his jokes. I always wondered why, until I realized that actually he had the habit of announcing new policies on the television, which would almost invariably require superhuman activity over the next 2 weeks in order to realize it. For example, when he announced the formation of the new university, the Bolivarian University, he did it on television and told people that they should apply in 2 weeks' time. None of the people at the university had any prepared programs. They didn't know how to decide who could come in and who couldn't. And they worked very hard, and 2 weeks later, the process of matriculation began. So what changed, I think, and this moment exposed, I think, a contradiction when we talk about Hugo Chavez. Because Hugo Chavez spoke on behalf of a new idea of grassroots democratic politics, on the one hand. Yet what became clear very quickly was that the new party was in fact highly centralized, controlled very much from above, and really its democratic promise was not going to be fulfilled. And so people on the ground, when you spoke to them, still spoke incessantly about Poder Popular, about the comunas, about all the different forms that grassroots democracy could take. But obviously I have to compress this into just a couple of sentences. It's a very complex process. But in the course of the next 6 years, up to the point of Chavez's death, I think a gap widens between, on the one hand, the hope and expectation of decentralization and an economy increasingly dedicated to producing for the good of the people and diverting income from oil, first to paying for social programs, and secondly to diversifying and extending the economy so that it would be increasingly possible for it to depend less and less on oil. That was the promise. 6 years on, the democracy on the ground, in my view, and let's discuss it, is actually very questionable. I think things are very much controlled from above, which calls into question the direct democracy that was promised. Now, while Chavez was alive and in power, his charisma and his extraordinary, the confidence he inspired in ordinary people could sustain that contradiction and that paradox. When Chavez died, the next president, Nicolas Maduro, it's not about his personal qualities. Chavez was a very particular individual, the product of a very particular time. Without Chavez, the paradox began to widen. And the reality was that behind the new party, there had begun to form an increasingly powerful bureaucracy, which was also, I'm sad to say, and I am sad to say it, increasingly corrupt, and also increasingly inefficient. So 6 years on, as we move from 2012, 13, and so on, if you like, the program is not fulfilled. The devolution of power is there only at the level of rhetoric, but in the reality it isn't. and the promise of diversifying the economy has not been fulfilled. That is the reason why, by 2013, the economic crisis deepens. There is a section of the population, those who supported Chavismo, the poorest sections, are in some sense protected by subsidy and by social provision, by the social wage. In some senses too, the lower middle class are perhaps the most vulnerable, and it is their protest that's realized. But what they are protesting about is real. You know, there are real problems. Inflation is real, shortages are real. But those who are, if you like, leading this process of protest, those who are claiming the leadership of it, those who are, to my mind, using this opportunity, have very different objectives. I don't believe that the leaders of this movement are really concerned about restoring the purchasing power of middle-class families. I think their purpose is to bring down Chavismo and to restore, as they tried to do 3 times before, to restore an old system which benefited a few at the expense of the many. And the evidence for that, I think, is the fact that there is no electoral strategy anywhere near this protest movement. Instead, it's a strategy to bring down government, to make, as some people say, make the society ungovernable. However, if Venezuela is to have a future and to continue the promise of Chavismo, then to my mind, it will come not just as a result of the defeat of a protest movement which I think is taking on increasingly violent and destructive characteristics, but at the same time, and inescapably, restoring to the grassroots the power to control and shape the future of the society and the economy. Because without that, the accusations of a society where power is increasingly concentrated in a few hands, which are many of them very grasping hands and are corrupt, where the lack of control has permitted corruption, right, has created and both sustained a problem. So the problem is twofold. It is a double crisis. On the one hand, there's the crisis, a class struggle inside Venezuela, where one side is very clearly in the business of undermining the entire Chavista project. But on the other hand, there is a crisis within Chavismo about what that project really is. And I'm going to do something which is dreadful, really, but I'm going to read my own words to you, just a few lines, if I may, because I think probably, I like to think that maybe it encapsulates the problem in a few lines, so forgive me. It's just in the last couple of pages. It says this: Chavez declared what he was building was, a quote, a 21st century socialism. Right. This is what I say here at the end of the book. A 21st century socialism, whatever its specific characteristics, requires an organization that can mobilize and coordinate the Chavistas at the grassroots, the potential subjects of any socialist revolution. Because the tradition that I see myself in is one that sees socialism as the process whereby the mass of ordinary people become the masters and mistresses of their own lives, not about swapping one bureaucracy for another. PSUV belongs to the bureaucracy. A new socialist organization, whatever its form, or its single or multiple ideologies, cannot by definition be formed by that layer. How can it? How can a leading layer construct a project about genuine grassroots democracy? The alternative, if it is to carry that project forward and fulfill it, must be, and this is what I say, independent, critical and visionary. No existing current can claim the right to ownership of the project because it has to emerge out of the experience and consciousness of the movements of the poor and the working class. Its form and content will be determined in the struggles to come. But it will be determined by then in the struggles to come, to the extent that out of this crisis comes a renewed confidence and a renewed sense of devolving power and control of the process back to the grassroots, who after all created and were the basis of Chavismo.